There is a certain kind of question that doesn't make any noise when it arrives. It doesn't crash into your life with a big event or a sudden change. It just appears one day, quietly, like light under a closed door. For me, it came in the form of a small, almost silly thought. If love is so important, why does my life feel loud, but my heart feels so quiet? It was a confusing feeling, because outwardly, everything looked fine. There were people around me, messages on my phone, conversations happening every day. But somewhere underneath all of that, I sensed that the most honest parts of my life weren't in the loud moments, but in the quiet ones. And I didn't know what to do with that. Around that time, I came across a simple line in an interview. Someone asked Keanu Reeves about fame, about people's excitement, and he answered in that gentle, thoughtful way he has. And then on another occasion, Sandra Bullock spoke about him with this calm warmth, describing the way he would do small kind things without announcing them. Neither of them used big words like soulmate or destiny. They mostly talked about respect, stillness, and showing up. I remember closing the video and just sitting there, a little stunned by how quiet it all felt. There was no drama, no big declarations. Just two people who seemed to understand that not everything meaningful needs an audience. That stayed with me. It made me think of the title that kept echoing in my mind. Love was never loud, but Keanu Reeves and Sandra Bullock found it in quiet moments. Not found each other, not fell in love, not the greatest love story ever told. Just found it. Something gentle. Something human. Something that doesn't necessarily need to be named to be real. I started wondering, what if the most important kind of love is not the one that steals the scene, but the one that quietly changes how you move through the world? I didn't have an answer yet, but a few simple, real moments from my own life began to rise to the surface. I remember a night when I sat alone in a small kitchen, long after everyone had gone to sleep. The only light was from the fridge, still slightly open as I stood there drinking water, not because I was thirsty, but because I didn't know what else to do with my hands. It had been a noisy day. Arguments, messages, notifications, opinions, all of it swirling around me. People who loved me had raised their voices for my own good. People who cared about me had insisted they knew what was best. I didn't doubt their intentions, yet somehow, I felt more misunderstood than supported. In that silence, I realized something. Most of the love I had been taught to recognize was loud. It explained itself. It justified itself. It demanded to be acknowledged. Look how much I love you. See how much I'm doing. Hear how worried I am. But as I stood there in that sleepy kitchen, what I missed most wasn't someone shouting their concern. I missed the feeling of being quietly understood. The feeling that someone could sit with me, without asking me to perform my pain or tidy it up for their comfort. And I thought again of those calm interviews, of how some people can sit beside each other and not fill the air with noise. Just presence. Just being. I wondered if I even knew how to recognize that kind of love. There's a small story I carry with me. It's not about famous people, and yet, somehow, it feels connected to them, because it reflects the same quieter language. Years ago, I had a friend I was very close to. We never put a label on it. We never gave any grand speeches. There was just an ease between us that didn't need to be advertised. We used to meet at this tiny cafe that always smelled faintly of burnt coffee and old wood. We both had busy, messy lives, but once or twice a month, we'd find our way back to that same small table in a corner. What I remember most is not what we said, but what we didn't have to say. He would notice when my hands were restless and ask me about my week without making it sound like an interrogation. I would notice when he became quiet in a certain way, the kind of quiet that meant something was weighing on him. One evening, I was particularly drained. Nothing tragic had happened. It was just one of those slow emotional leaks you don't notice until you feel empty. Work stress, family tensions, a friendship that had shifted without explanation. The kind of pain that doesn't earn you much sympathy because, from the outside, everything still seems fine. We sat there, and he could tell I didn't have the energy to tell the whole story from the beginning. So he didn't push. Instead, he did something I still think about today. He took out a small notebook he always carried, tore out a blank page, and drew a line across the middle with his pen. On the top half, he wrote, "Things I can't fix for you." On the bottom half, he wrote, "Things I can help you carry." Then he slid the paper to me and said, "You don't need to tell me everything. Just put one word on each side, so I know how to sit with you tonight." He didn't demand to be let in. He didn't insist on being the hero of my story. He just offered to share the weight a little more consciously. I stared at that piece of paper for a long time. Finally, on the top half, I wrote, "Past." On the bottom half, I wrote, "Today." He read it, nodded, folded the paper, and tucked it back into his notebook. "Okay," he said. "Then tonight, we'll only talk about today." No speeches. No advice. No declarations about what our relationship meant. He simply adjusted his presence to match what I could hold at that moment. That night, I slept better than I had in weeks. I wouldn't have called it love at the time. It didn't look like the movies. It wasn't dramatic or passionate or intense. But years later, when I heard Sandra Bullock describe quiet acts of thoughtfulness, and Keanu Reeves talk about people without centering himself, something clicked. Maybe love, in its most honest form, often looks like this: a folded piece of paper, a shared silence, a small adjustment made purely for the other person's sake. As I grew older, I started noticing how deeply I equated love with volume. If someone really loved me, I thought, they would make it obvious. They would chase me, fight for me, argue passionately, insist on their concern. They would be loud enough that I never had to doubt. But the problem with that expectation is that it doesn't leave much room for quiet people, or for quiet forms of love. It doesn't leave space for the person who supports you consistently but never makes a big show of it. Or the friend who always remembers how you take your coffee, but rarely sends long emotional messages. Or the family member who can't express themselves well with words, but always shows up to help you move, fix things, or just sit with you when you're sick. I started asking myself a different kind of question. What if I've been walking past the quietest, truest forms of love because they didn't match the idea I had in my head? Slowly, I began to trace back through my life and recognize those moments I had overlooked. The teacher who secretly left an encouraging note on my desk when I was going through a hard time, without drawing attention to it. The colleague who gently covered for my mistakes early in my career, but never used it later to gain leverage or praise. The neighbor who always carried one extra grocery bag up the stairs, wordlessly placing it by my door when I had a newborn and was too exhausted to shop. None of them made speeches about how caring they were. None of them said, "Look at the kind of person I am." They just showed up, quietly, reliably, and I realized something both simple and unsettling. I had spent years craving a love I could hear, while often missing the love that was quietly present in the background. When people talk about Keanu Reeves and Sandra Bullock, they often focus on the rare warmth between them. They mention the way they speak about each other with consistent respect, even after many years, without oversharing or sensationalizing anything. They notice the way Sandra said she thought they could have survived as a couple because of who he is, not because of some grand, romantic movie moment. What interests me is not whether they were ever really in love. That's their story, not ours. What interests me is what their way of talking about each other reveals. That there is a form of affection, of deep regard, that doesn't need to prove itself, label itself, or dominate the room. It exists in subtle glances, shared jokes, steady kindness, and a trust that doesn't require constant reassurance. In a world that measures love in grand gestures, this kind of quiet is almost philosophical. It asks us to rethink what we value. Is love something that must always be stamped with a title, a status, a public confirmation? Or can it also be a continuous, gentle presence that simply leaves you better than it found you? There was another moment in my life that forced me to confront this question more directly. I had been in a romantic relationship that started like a firework. Everything was loud. Our laughs, our plans, our messages. We were dramatic and certain and full of big statements. In the beginning, it felt intoxicating. Finally, I thought, this is love the way everyone describes it. But as time went by, the volume that once felt exciting began to exhaust me. Our arguments were as intense as our romance. Small disagreements turned into long debates. Any quiet moment between us felt like a problem to be solved, a sign that something was wrong. We didn't know how to sit together in silence without rushing to fill it. When it ended loudly too. Tears, speeches, explanations. It felt like the closing scene of a movie. For months afterward, I felt empty and oddly shaky, as if I had been screaming over loud music for too long, and now, in the sudden quiet, I couldn't quite hear myself think. During that period, I found myself watching quieter interviews, slower conversations, stories that didn't try to sell me a fantasy. I watched people like Keanu, who seemed comfortable with pauses, and Sandra, who could speak warmly about someone without trying to own the narrative. I remember thinking, maybe what I want now is not a love that consumes me, but a love that lets me hear my own thoughts better. That realization didn't arrive as a big revelation. It came slowly, over many small evenings at home alone, over walks without headphones, over writing my thoughts down in a notebook instead of sending them to someone else to fix. I started to ask myself, what does it feel like, inside my body, when I'm around people who genuinely care about me in a healthy way? The answer surprised me. It didn't feel like racing heartbeats or butterflies. It felt like relief. My shoulders lowered. My breathing slowed. My laugh became easier, more natural. I didn't feel like I was being tested or evaluated. Love, I began to see, was not supposed to be a constant performance. It wasn't supposed to be loud applause or non-stop drama. It was closer to the feeling of sitting in a room with someone and realizing you don't need to protect yourself as much. A softening. A quiet. There is a particular kind of courage required to accept this. It means stepping away from the stories you've been handed, the ones that tell you love is only real if it's obvious, public, and intense. It means facing the parts of yourself that equate chaos with passion, anxiety with importance, and exhaustion with depth. It also means acknowledging a bittersweet truth. Not every meaningful connection in your life will fit into a familiar box. Some people will come into your life with the shape of something grand and obvious: partner, spouse, the one. Others will arrive more gently: a friend, a collaborator, a quiet constant. A person who never asks for a bigger role, but who, years later, you realize shaped your understanding of what care can look like. When we look at public figures like Keanu Reeves and Sandra Bullock, we often feel an instinctive warmth, a wish to project a story onto them. They must be secretly in love. There must be more. But maybe what draws us in is not a hidden romance. Maybe it's the simple, profound relief of seeing two people treat each other with a consistency that doesn't need spectacle. Maybe what we long for is not their exact story, but the quality of it. Kindness without ownership. Affection without possession. Respect without performance. A love that doesn't always need to announce itself. Over time, my own life slowly rearranged itself around this understanding. I began to listen more carefully, not to people's declarations, but to how I felt in their presence. Did I feel seen, or just observed? Did I feel invited, or pulled? Did I feel I could be quiet with them? I noticed which friendships left me drained from constant emotional noise, and which ones allowed space for gentle silence. I noticed who remembered small details without making those details into proof of their virtue. I noticed who respected my boundaries without making me explain them over and over again. And just as importantly, I noticed my own habits. How often had I tried to prove my love by being loud, over-giving, over-explaining, over-involving myself in someone else's pain, because I was afraid that if I did less, I would matter less? How often had I mistaken control for care and drama for depth? Slowly, I began to practice a different kind of love. I tried to be present without taking over. I tried to help without needing credit. I tried to listen, not so I could respond impressively, but so the other person could hear themselves more clearly. Sometimes I failed. Old habits are sticky, but even in failure, a new question helped steady me. If love itself is already there, quietly, do I really need to make so much noise about it? The more I sat with that question, the more I saw that love, real, patient, human love, is often found in moments that no one else will ever know about. A phone call answered at midnight, not to give advice, but simply to say, "I'm here." Breathe. A cup of tea placed by someone's side while they work through something difficult, without turning it into a conversation unless they ask. A text that says, "No need to reply. Just wanted you to know I'm thinking of you." Letting someone walk away because you finally understand that clinging to them is more about your fear than about their freedom. Choosing not to share a private detail someone trusted you with, even though it would make a great story. Or, as in that small cafe long ago, sliding a piece of paper across a table and saying, in your own way, "You don't have to tell me everything. Just let me know how to love you today." None of these things will ever trend, or go viral, or be praised publicly, but they shape people quietly, from the inside. Maybe that's what we glimpse, in a distant way, when we see two people like Keanu Reeves and Sandra Bullock treat each other with such steady gentleness over the years. Not a secret epic romance, but something perhaps even more rare, a way of caring that doesn't need to shout. Love was never meant to be only the loudest thing in the room. Sometimes it is a hand on your shoulder when words would only get in the way. Sometimes it is someone giving you space, not because they don't care, but because they finally understand that your growth needs room. Sometimes it is a quiet, private respect that exists long after a chapter has officially ended. And sometimes it is simply this, the feeling that somewhere in this noisy world, there are a few people with whom you do not have to explain or defend the softest parts of yourself. We are taught to chase after grand stories. But as life unfolds, we begin to see that the real work, the real transformation, happens in much smaller, gentler places. In the mornings when you choose to speak kindly to yourself after years of inner criticism. In the moments when you step back from an argument, not because you've given up, but because you've realized that protecting the relationship matters more than winning the point. In the quiet friendships that don't need constant updates to remain real. One day, perhaps, you will look back and notice that the people who changed you the most were not the ones who made the biggest noise, but the ones whose quiet presence taught you a calmer way of being alive. And you may find yourself whispering, almost in surprise, "Love was here all along. It was just speaking in a softer voice than I expected." That is the gentle mystery of it. Love was never loud. But in the quiet moments, in shared silences, in unspoken understanding, in the calm respect between two people who see each other clearly, it becomes impossible to ignore. Not because it demands your attention, but because, for the first time in a long time, your heart has finally learned how to listen.